In the final section of this chapter, we'll look at the large intestine, beginning with the gross anatomy. The large intestine receives about 500 milliliters of indigestible residue per day. Once the small intestine has extracted everything that's useful, the rest of it passes through as feces. It gets reduced to about 100 milliliters of feces because the large intestine absorbs a lot of water, which follows salts, and the feces is eliminated by defecation. The large intestine is about 5 feet long, about 2 inches in diameter in a cadaver where it's not distended as much. It begins at the cecum, where the ileocecal valve joins, and continues around the abdominal cavity until it ends at the rectum. The appendix is attached to the cecum, and it's densely populated with lymphocytes, so it acts as a significant source of immune cells. The ascending colon, ascending to mean going upwards, is here. The transverse colon is here, across the top of the abdominal cavity. The descending colon here. And the sigmoid colon is this S-shaped portion that leads down towards the rectum. There are two notable bends. There's the right colic flexure, or the hepatic flexure, right here. And then there's the left colic or splenic flexure. And they're called hepatic versus splenic because those are the organs that each of the respective big bends are close to. The rectum is the portion of the large intestine that ends at the anal canal. It has 3 curves and 3 infoldings called rectal valves. These rectal valves actually allow feces to remain in the rectum while passing gas. The anal canal is the final 3 centimeters of the large intestine. It's right here. Within the anus, there are anal columns and anal sinuses, and they exude mucus to lubricate the anal canal during defecation. As feces pressures against them, they secrete more mucus. There are also large hemorrhoidal veins in the superficial plexus in anal columns around the orifice. And when these become distended, because they don't have valves or anything like regular veins, they protrude into the anal canal sometimes and form bulges external to the anus. This is the cause of hemorrhoids. The muscularis externa of the colon is pretty unusual. It has these longitudinal fibers that you'll see here down the center. They're called tenia coli. When the tenia coli contract, it causes these pouches here. They're called huestra or huestrum for singular. The internal anal sphincter and the external anal sphincter work in a fairly similar means as the sphincters for the urinary bladder. There are also these omental appendages. We don't really know what the function of these are yet, but they're club-like fatty pouches that hang off the colon. Both the ascending and descending colon are retroperitoneal. However, the transverse colon and the sigmoid colon are intraperitoneal. So again, it's like half of the large intestine got pushed through the peritoneal lining and thus has serosa, and the other 2 ascending and descending portions remained behind the peritoneal lining. So if we look a little deeper into the structure of the large intestine, we'll see that the mucosa is a simple columnar epithelium throughout the entire large intestine. We don't see any circular folds or villi to increase surface area in the large intestine. The anal canal is lined with non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium in its lower half in order to provide resistance against abrasion from defecation. The large intestine does have intestinal crypts. They're much larger than the intestinal crypts of the small intestine. They're glands sunken deep into the lamina propria. And they are pretty much just mucus secreting goblet cells down in the crypts. That's the only notable secretion. The lamina propria and submucosal layers have a large amount of lymphatic tissue. And this makes sense because it's going to provide us protection from the bacteria that populate the large intestine. Because as you probably know, the large intestine has a very dense population of bacteria. In fact, there's about 800 different species of bacteria populating the large intestine. We have a mutually beneficial relationship with many of these. We provide them with room and board, and they provide us with nutrients from our food that we're not equipped to extract on our own. For example, they can digest cellulose, pectin, and other plant polysaccharides that we don't have the digestive enzymes to digest for ourselves. We can then absorb the resulting sugars. So we actually get much more nutrition from our food because of these bacteria. And this is what might explain why some people get more calories from their food than other people. It's just from the varying population density of the bacteria in the large intestine. Some of these bacteria will help synthesize vitamin B and vitamin K, which are absorbed in the colon. Vitamin K is especially important because the diet alone usually doesn't provide enough. So we depend on these bacteria to produce it for us. One of the less desirable effects of bacteria in our intestine is flatulence or gas. And it's pretty amazing, actually, that the average person has about 7 to 10 liters of gas stored in the large intestine. Most of it, the large intestine can reabsorb. However, about 500 milliliters a day on average will sneak out. But imagine if the large intestine didn't absorb all of those liters of gas. Woo! Most of the gas we get because we swallowed air. Some of it's from bacterial production. We'll see hydrogen sulfide and indole and scatol. And these are the molecules that add the stink to feces and flatulence. The other gases have no smell at all. Another interesting thing with flatulence is hydrogen gas. This is what could explain, maybe you've seen it, people lighting their farts on fire. And gas has been seen to explode during electrical cauterization when they fix hemorrhoids in surgery. Now, it takes about 12 to 24 hours for a meal to be reduced to feces in the large intestine. There's no chemical change in the residue that travels through the large intestine. We're just reabsorbing water and electrolytes, predominantly sodium chloride. Feces itself consists of about 75% water and 25% of it solids. Of that solid, 30% are bacteria, 30% undigested fiber, and 10 to 20% is fat. A small amount of mucus, and then some sloughed epithelial cells. Now the fat is not from consumed fat, but that's released from the sloughed epithelial cells. The huestral contractions occur every 30 minutes. This is where each huestra will contract and push its contents onto the next. This is a form of segmentation. And it's distension of the huestrum itself, so the food in it or the residue in it that stretches it and causes it to contract back against there and squeeze it onto the next section. The other kind of motility is mass movement. And this occurs 1 to 3 times a day. It's triggered by gastrocolic and duodenocolic reflexes. So the filling of the stomach and the duodenum will stimulate motility in the colon. And it actually moves stuff along for several centimeters with each contraction. And this might explain why it's very common for someone within an hour after eating a breakfast, let's say, to need a bowel movement. So these mass movements can stretch the rectum, which would cause this defecation reflex. We're probably all pretty familiar with that need to go. The intrinsic defecation reflex works entirely within the myenteric plexus of the large intestine itself. So the feces moving through the rectum causes stretch and then contraction back against that stretch. And that can cause the internal sphincter to relax. But these are relatively weak contractions. So it's mostly necessary to see the parasympathetic defecation reflex involved. This involves the spinal cord. So stretching of the rectum sends sensory signals to the spinal cord, and then the pelvic nerves return signals, intensifying peristalsis, and relax the internal sphincter. Defecation will only occur when the time is right. This is where we have top-down control impulses from the cerebral cortex, which will open the external anal sphincter. Very similar to what we see in the external and internal urethral sphincters. Another thing that can aid in defecation are the Valsalva maneuvers, so holding of the breath and increasing abdominal pressure. And that lifts muscles of the pelvic floor upwards and thus acts to help push feces outwards. So take a moment here to diagram this parasympathetic defecation reflex and perhaps include a little bit of intrinsic defecation reflex. And see what you recall. And finally, we're done with our chapter on the digestive system. Go ahead and complete the Learn Smart module associated with this chapter in Connect. Be sure to finish your diagrams, and then we'll be ready to move on to the next chapter on nutrition and metabolism.